everyone. Welcome to the Sally and Ralph Duchin a campus lecture series in Judaic Studies. I'm David Graysboard, and I form part of the Arizona Center for Judaic Studies. And this afternoon, I'm happy to welcome back Professor Adam Rovner, the director of the Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Denver. Professor Rovner is a professor of English and also an expert in Jewish literature, including Hebrew literature. During the fall semester, as some of our friends may remember, as part of our Poses lecture series, Professor Rovner presented some aspects of his latest philological and historical research into the relationship between Blacks and Jews in West Africa in the 19th century by exploring the experiences of a rather, in my view, a kind of an opportunistic and sort of unsavory merchant adventurer, an Anglo-Jewish merchant adventurer. Anyway, so today, Professor Rovner returns to the now seemingly exotic haunts that have long fascinated him and which formed the basis of his acclaimed book from 2014, In the Shadow of Zion, Promised Lands Before Israel. These, by the way, are the same exotic areas that inform Professor Rovner's short documentary on the phenomenon of Jewish territorialism, which we'll discuss in a moment. The film is called, or the video is called No Land Without Heaven, and that work can be seen, as indeed it has been seen at exhibitions in New York, Paris, and Tel Aviv. In a moment, Professor Rovner and I will talk for about 45 minutes on the history of a scheme to create a Jewish homeland in northwestern Australia and then in the island of Tasmania. Before that, however, it behooves me to let you know the sad news of the recent passing of Sally Duchin, whose name graces this lecture series. Mrs. Duchin and her husband, Ralph, of blessed memory, were longtime supporters of Judaic Studies here at Arizona. They were especially interested in enriching the lives of Jewish students, and all students, in fact, here at the U of A. So I am very glad that we have an occasion to remember them through this event, and also to continue their legacy by continuing to create and support high-quality programming of the kind that they sponsored. If you're interested in following in the Duchin's footsteps, please visit our departmental website, judaic.arizona.edu, and you can learn about our activities, find ways to contribute, find ways to support Jewish studies here. Let me conclude this brief introduction by thanking Fernanda Charles, Martha Castleberry, and Dominic Munoz for their assistance in setting up this webinar. Of course, I want to thank you, our audience. Please write your questions in the Q&A section that will follow our discussion. Click on the Q&A section of the Zoom window, which is really toward the lower right-hand side. And again, toward the end, we'll be taking your questions and comments. Okay, so with that said, again, Adam Rovner, welcome back. You've given us a very interesting title to chew on, and I have a sense of what it's about. But please let our audience know what this is all about. Give them some background information so that they can understand the title. What is this notion to create a Zion or New Jerusalem in Australia? What sort of homeland did the proponents envision? Who proposed this, etc.? So, give us the context of the proposal.
Sure. Well, thanks. First of all, thank you, David, for having me back again, and thanks, of course, to the Duchin family, who I didn't get a chance to know, but I'm grateful for their generosity as well, and thanks, Fernanda and Martha and my friend Leonard Hammer, should he watch this in the future, or to anyone really watching it in the future. So to contextualize this, my book is about 6 different plans to create Jewish homelands that were not going to be in the biblical land of Israel. The idea was that there needed to be in the the early 19th through the early 20th century, an immediate place to a humanitarian effort to rescue Jews, and they needed a homeland. Mm-hmm. So this even precedes Theodor Herzl by about 70 years. In the 1820s, it's a very interesting American politician and journalist, as well as a very important playwright in early America by the name of Mordecai Emanuel Noah. And he, following the riots, the Hep Hep riots in the early 19th century, around 1819 or so, he decided that he needed to create a Jewish homeland, and he thought America was the perfect place in order to rescue. So the early effort, this precedes Herzl again, is really a humanitarian effort. What happens is that Herzl's proposal gets off the ground in the 1890s, and this is both a humanitarian and a state-building exercise, a kind of version of romantic nationalism. But following 1903, which is when the Kishinev pogroms occurred, and there's a really good book about that recently by Steve Zipperstein. The Kishinev pogroms really catalyzed support for Zionism, in particular for its humanitarian elements. The idea of rescuing, getting them out of Tsarist Russia. That was the idea. And this effort, this humanitarian effort, actually ended up splitting the Zionist movement for a while. So I focused, rather than on the what became known as the so-called practical or political elements of Zionism after Herzl died, he died in 1904, I focused on the humanitarian strain, you could say. If you want to think about in terms of evolution, it was a branch of Jewish nationalism's development that ended up not bearing any fruit. Mm-hmm. And that's what I focused on, because I was very interested in this humanitarian effort, which to me has always been a signal part of Zionism, but is sometimes downplayed in the history. So that's how I moved into this idea of territorialism. And territorialism split from Zionism in 1905. There was a crisis because in 1903, the British government, following Kishinev, offered Herzl and his very powerful British supporters, including a very well-known writer at the time, probably the most well-known Jewish writer in the world, certainly the most well-known English writer in the world, and that was Israel Zangwill. Zangwill was responsible for promoting Zionism throughout the English-speaking world. He was a very important intellectual voice in America as well, and elsewhere, in the English-speaking world, really. His efforts yielded a proposal from the government under Chamberlain to create this Jewish state. He was the foreign secretary, Chamberlain, to create this Jewish state in Uganda. Now, it was never in Uganda. Many people who've studied Zionism know about the Uganda plan. I've encountered many people who don't even know it wasn't ever in Uganda. It was always in Kenya, what was then called the East African Protectorate. It was mislabeled by Chamberlain and later by the Zionists, and they took up this idea of the Uganda plan. When the Zionist Congress in 1905 rejected the so-called Uganda plan as a humanitarian way station, as an asylum, as a sanctuary, a territorial sanctuary for a Jewish state, the seed for a Jewish state, the Zionist Congress rejected it, and at that point, Israel Zangwill led a large number of delegates out of the hall in Basel. This was again in Basel. They left the hotel and went to another hotel and then set up a rival organization called the Jewish Territorial Organization. It was known by its acronym, which was the ITO or the ITO. And this organization had a kind of intellectual history that led to this failed Australia plan, which was promoted in the pre-World War II years and into World War II, which was tragic.
Mhm.
Does that give you enough context? I realize it went on for a long time. But
And I think so. I mean, if people have questions,
yeah.
about the specifics, we can get to them in time. And I'm sure as you discuss specific aspects, the picture will be absolutely complete. Um, Obviously, you've introduced us to territorialism, which is a form of Jewish nationalism. And this, in hindsight, of course, it was very unsuccessful. Now, the term nationalism, if I'm not mistaken, tends to carry a rather negative connotation in the United States. How do you define nationalism? Just so we're clear on the nature of the phenomenon in question.
So I think that we have this idea of nationalism as essentially and always negative. At least those of us who tend to be more on the left have that idea. I think that in a sense it is probably more objective, more neutral than we often give it credit for. Although I'm not blind to history and fact that typically it does take on, as it evolves, chauvinistic
Mm-hmm.
attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that for me, what is most interesting about the territorialists was the idea that they would create a kind of sovereign entity or
Mm-hmm.
autonomous entity, a place that had borders that was going to be either sovereignly protected or protected under the guise of another power. That was also an idea that there would be a language that was a Jewish language spoken there, that Jews would have control over the culture, over the education, over the business, even if not the military defense of this country.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a kind of, often in their visions, a demilitarized, or maybe you could say a somewhat toothless nationalism, but certainly a high degree of cultural autonomy, governmental autonomy, and even in some of these ideas, sovereignty that was projected to exist or grow in these areas. For me, the idea of self-determination, of a collectivity that defines itself as a people, is the essence of the desire behind nationalism. A
Mm-hmm.
group of people determines that they are connected by some kind of history, by some kind of memory. Perhaps it is imaginary. Perhaps it is folklore. They have certain folk ways, customs, possibly religions in common. They have a language typically in common. And this group of people want the right for self-determination, that is to determine their own national or people
Mm-hmm.
future. To me, that's kind of where nationalism comes from.
Sure.
I know that scholars of nationalism have competing definitions and different approaches to this idea,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that nationalism really arises in the form we know it today in a modern period, or maybe a pre-modern period, 18th, 19th century, where we really start seeing these romantic nationalisms coalescing, often around language, place, sometimes but not always religion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely emphasize those elements whenever I present nationalisms to, let's say, to my students, as well as the notion of kinship, both fictive and demonstrable. So what you've just described in connection to territorialism sounds to me to be generally consonant with classical liberalism, maybe more so than something like Bundism, right, which presupposes a socialist revolution, power for the workers, and so forth. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair, and it's also kind of interesting in that um, there many, but not all, but many of the Zionists adhered to a more socialist or kind of loosely communitarian sort of economic ideas,
Mhm.
but not all of them. There were many sort of opponents to socialism as well. I think
Yeah.
you have to take Jabotinsky in a little bit later than the period I'm talking to as a one of his prime objections to the Zionist movement was actually economic. He just didn't really like the socialists at all. But Israel Zangwill, who was the head of the territorial movement after Herzl's death, I would call Herzl a territorialist Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
To his decease in 1904, he didn't live to see the rejection of the Uganda plan. He did not vote for or against it. He was as the leader. He didn't vote. The sort of executives didn't vote one way or another on this. The rank and file voted. So Israel Zangwill is the kind of prime mover of this idea, and territorialism was a classical liberal. I mean, he tended towards a sort of, I don't know his exact economics, but he tended towards a liberal vision of in England and for the world. He was acquainted with more extreme visions. He, as I recall, he actually had known Prince Peter Kropotkin, the anarchist thinker in London. So it wasn't out of a naivete. You could say a lot of things about Zangwill. He wasn't naive.
Interesting. You make me think that that Herzl's death led, in a sense, to the refraction of several of his tendencies into various different camps. I mean, on one hand, you had Herzl, the proponent of a Jews state in the homeland, in the land of Israel. And on the other hand, you have Herzl, the territorialist, as you put it, the very practical fellow who simply wants to save Jews wherever that is possible. Okay, very good. So
that's right, David. And that only increased post Kishinev for Herzl. And if you read Altneuland, Herzl's sci-fi, utopian, speculative fiction, whatever you want to call it, Old New Land is how it's translated into English, or as it was translated into Hebrew, Tel Aviv is the original translation,
right.
Which is how the city got its name.
Sure.
That book imagines, as you say, a Jews state, and that's a good way of putting it. It is a state that is a new society, a communitarian society that Jews found and existed in what appears to be a demographic majority, but it also is open to non-Jews. In fact, the bad guy in Altneuland, to the extent that the novel has a plot, the bad guy is a Jewish, what we might call a Jewish nationalist who wants to kick all the non-Jews out of the new society.
Interesting. Yeah, Altneuland, of course, Herzl's very interesting sort of, as you put it, sci-fi utopic novel. Now, back to Australia and the various schemes that territorialists envisioned. Can you give us a specific example of how these proponents of the Australian Zion, if you will, proposed or formulated this plan? And I'm curious to hear you explain to us how the specific content and style of the proposals in question tell us about Jewish history during the era of, budding nationalisms.
So, nationalisms were already an established fact. We're now looking at, I'm going to say, the 1930s. So there are nationalisms already established fact. Fascist nationalisms are on the rise, and this is a kind of liberal, socialist, intellectual, almost utopian nationalist project. The first real firm ground for what my book talks about is in the 1930s when a Yiddish writer and a former functionary for a Jewish writers organization, very, very important one, in Warsaw, a guy by the pen name of Melech Ravitch, he goes to Australia. And he goes ostensibly to raise funds for Jewish institutions in Poland, but really, as he discloses, he's looking for a place to settle the Jews because he is a catastrophist. He sees the end coming for Polish Jewry. In fact, so much so that he is the man that Isaac Bashevis Singer credited with impressing upon him the need to leave Poland. And that's actually in Zinger's biography.
Mhm.
Zachariah Melechowicz goes to Australia. He travels around. He sees the land. He sees a great deal of emptiness. And he's like, we can make a settlement in the north, a little bit west of Australia. We can create a settlement for about 100,000 Jews here. He's a member of a territorialist organization in Warsaw, and he files these dispatches, publishes travel articles in Warsaw newspapers, and it begins to catch on among the coterie of territorialists who are in Poland, in France, and in England mostly. There's a few elsewhere, but those are maybe the key areas. In England, in particular, because of its ties, both culturally and diplomatically, politically, with Australia, this is especially interesting. And the territorialist organization at the time, which were called the Freeland League, Freilandisten, we can call them in English, the Freilandisten send their most powerful speaker, their most powerful propagandist, their most effective diplomat, I guess, emissary to Australia in the 30s to see if Melechravich's reports are accurate. He goes there, he docks in Perth in, I think, 38, I'm forgetting the date exactly. He finds and hires an agricultural scientist, and they set off for the Kimberley region in northwest Australia. They conduct surveys, they do temperature, they interview people, they create a whole scientific report. They submit it to the Western governor, who's very skeptical of this, although he later approves it. This man is named Isaac Nachman Steinberg. Isaac Nachman Steinberg in English. This is the guy who the Freeland League sends. He's an amazing guy. He was a Jewish intellectual, Orthodox Jew. He was also a radical revolutionary. And he was exiled in the failed revolution of 1905, goes to Germany, completes a doctorate in Talmudic law, returns then with his degree to the Tsarist Russia and begins to agitate for revolution again. He is part of a non-Marxist, leftist social revolutionary group, and they come to power with Lenin during the revolution, and he's part of the first government. He's part of that first revolutionary government. He's, in fact, the Commissar of Justice. He's the first Soviet Commissar of Justice. He finds himself on the wrong side of Lenin and ends up leaving. And he goes to Germany. He flees he flees before the Gestapo can arrest him and ends up in England. And now he's in this peripatetic man's life. He's now an Orthodox Jewish non-Zionist in Australia conducting scientific expedition to northwest Australia, and he agrees with Melechowicz, although his figure is somewhat less optimistic. He thinks about 75,000 Jews can go there, and so the Freeland League begins negotiations to purchase a territory about the size of Belgium, a massive ranch area. It's still a massive ranching area to this day. And they have approval from the governor. Everything is set. They are just trying to get the money to buy this land. They have the political will is there. There are editorials in the newspapers. There are big business leaders involved, industrialists involved. And then it's approved in August, at the end of August 1939, which, if you know your history, is an especially bad time to get a diplomatic agreement settled. And the Japanese then, a little bit later, bomb, actually, Darwin. And the plan is iced. And that's what gets us to Tasmania.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's a lot there. And as you're narrating this, I think, my goodness, you cannot make this stuff up. In many ways, this story proves, like many others, that history is in many ways stranger than fiction.
I agree.
But back to the question of style. The reason I ask is that, of course, nationalism, you might say, dovetailed Romanticism early on. By the 1930s, though, as you mentioned, nationalisms had become more or less well established. They had led to the formation of states or proto-states, lot of the successor states after the First World War. And what you've just described with regard to the northwestern corner of Australia sounds very, very technocratic. In other words, yeah, I mean, is this the, let's say, would you say that that is the fundamental nature of territorialism, or does it have, let's say, it's more poetic, let's say, pie in the sky kind of wing?
It's a really good question, David, and it's hard to say. I believe, look, Zionism, especially Herzlian Zionism, and he came in for criticism of this, is very technocratic. I mean, if you read Alt Neuland, it's just like a running balance sheet of tractors that are going to end
Right.
in the Holy Land.
Uh-huh.
But there's also the poetic side, the mythological side, the side of Jewish heritage and legacy, and that's really what animated people. I think, I believe.
Yeah.
The technocratic side of territorialism was certainly present, and they emphasized that precisely so that they wouldn't be considered utopians, precisely wouldn't be considered pie in the sky dreamers. They needed that grounding. So yes, it is absolutely technocratic. They had scientific surveys, they had maps made, they did interviews, they soil samples. This is part and parcel of the territorialist project. Possibly because of that, they didn't capture the majority's imagination. Even Zionism was not a wildly popular movement in the first half of the 20th century. There were obviously opponents to Zionism within the Jewish community that were very active, including the Reform Jewish movement, as well as the Bundists you mentioned, all kinds of groups.
Yeah.
Territorialists were maybe not anti-Zionist so much as they were non-Zionist or alternate, allo-Zionist, right? Alternate Zionists. They had a different vision.
Yeah.
Because they were humanitarian. I think the humanitarian element is emphasized in territorialism, and the state building apparatus, government apparatus is emphasized in Zionism, although it also has a humanitarian element, and both certainly share a technocratic element. When we move to the Tasmanian project, the reason why the Tasmanian project really is frozen is because of the war and the threat of Japanese invasion, and obviously there was violence up there. So that's when this amazing figure, this woman, Carolyn Isaacson, who is known by her pen name Linka, comes into the picture. She's the one who, again, practically, she's a journalist. She's the editor of the Woman's Page, which is a supplement to the Melbourne Age, still a major newspaper, and she was pretty well known at the time. She worked with immigrant groups, Jews, in Melbourne, and she's like, I have an idea. I know this guy, Critchley Parker Jr., whose father, Critchley Parker Sr., is extremely wealthy. He was a mining magnate, very well, a publishing guy, and he was well connected to the government. So they want to bring people to Tasmania. They want to develop Tasmania. So there's a coincidence of interest here. Develop Tasmania, find a place for the Jews. And now Carolyn Isaacson is the matchmaker between Critchley Parker Jr., who was a 29-year-old wealthy only son of this older family who's not Jewish, Critchley Parker. Isaacson is, and she knows all about Steinberg and the Freelance League's efforts because she's a journalist. She's covering this. They have a meeting, and Steinberg doesn't want to look at Tasmania. He's still fixated on the Kimberley region because it's already got government approval, and he's afraid that he's going to lose the momentum if he starts pursuing another avenue. It's going to be seen as not serious.
Right.
But this is the utilitarian method. This is what you're talking about, the a much more technocratic method. He agrees to go down there with Critchley Parker Jr., with Carolyn Isaacson Linka, to meet with the government of Tasmania, the governor of Tasmania, with the director of hydrology and the forests and this and the mining and all this stuff. And he's won over. He's convinced. And he switches, or at least temporarily supports, this Tasmania plan.
Yeah.
which is
Wow.
kind of remarkable. But so you're right in seeing the technocratic side.
So the desire, let's say, the Anglo-Australian desire for regional development, the technocratic motif, and the humanitarian concern are coming together to create something that seems viable. Of course, in retrospect, the notion of creating a homeland for Jews in, of all places, some corner of Australia seems rather harebrained. And I mean, while there was clearly some kind of official support, certainly technocratic support, I mean, it's hard for me to gauge whether this would have had support among Jews in general, even those, even within, let's say, the nationalist Jewish camp. What do you know about that? I mean, territorialism versus, let's say, Zionism, and also, I mean, I remember in the fifth chapter of your book, you mentioned that at one point this writer, I think it was the writer whose pen name was Melech Ravitch, he bemoaned the fact that he was only one of maybe 40 people who formed this, Freeland organization. So, I mean, do we have any indications of really what kind of popular support this had behind it, as distinct from, let's say, from Australian official support?
So there's a few things there. So first, I would say that it's difficult to know for sure, but my suspicion, and there are others who think this, is a great historian at University of Haifa in Israel, Gur al-Rawi, and he has persuaded me, and from what I've read as well, that really the support for territorialism was every bit as big, if not bigger, than the support for Zionism in the 19 teens and 20s. Zionism gets a big boost after the Balfour Declaration, but still territorialism is active. It's active because people like Zangwill and other territorialists continued to agitate for emigration from what was then Soviet Union, to get Jews out. You know, there was obviously Jews were supporting communism, but in the 19 teens, at least till Balfour Declaration, we see a great popularity for territorialism. Gore's done these studies, which are great, which demonstrate that the places that Jews came from to the U.S. in Tsarist Russia are the places where Zangwill's Jewish Territorialist organization published newspapers that explained how to get out of Tsarist Russia.
Wow.
They weren't necessarily the places where the pogroms were going on.
Right.
Information, they didn't know how to fill out the forms. They didn't know how to get out.
Yeah.
You look at these old territorialist newspapers, they explain how to do this. So pretty popular, had pretty good widespread attraction. After the Balfour Declaration, and again, you're talking about the Soviet system, many Jews fell in with communism, or they fell in more with Zionism because of its socialist or often communist sense. But, I think that most people then today, they just want to live their lives. I don't know that they're ideologically quite so committed. When we fast forward into the era I'm talking about, again, this is a humanitarian crisis. The Jews are being rounded up. They're being dispossessed. They're being killed. There are, Kristallnacht. This is 1938. This is not 1933. Yeah. And so we got to get the Jews out. And people like Melech Ravitch, who saw this coming, later people like Steinberg, who saw what was going on. These were people who didn't see an immediate future for Jewish life under the growing clouds of war. Yeah. And they wanted to get them out permanently to more hospitable regions and to create a kind of a tipping point, enough of a mass, enough of a compact majority that they could rule themselves. So I think that idea of being under stress, being persecuted, is often an engine, a mechanism for getting self-determination out there among a nation, a national group. That also happened here. So how popular it was, I think there was a lot of popular support for getting Jews out among Jews, certainly. not necessarily among other nations in the world. In the Evian conference, no one agreed to bump up their numbers except, maybe the Dominican Republic for various reasons.
Maybe you can tell people what the Evian conference was all about.
So the Evian conference was convened in 1938 to discuss what to do with all the Jews. So the question wasn't, should we get the Jews out? Shouldn't we get the Jews out? We need to get them out. Where do we put them? And none of the powers, the Allied powers, really agreed to any meaningful, that I can recall, increase in numbers. Dominican Republic, under their dictator Trujillo, he agreed to have some people come there, some Jews did escape that way. We shouldn't minimize that. But there were other statecraft reasons for that decision. So Jews were trapped. They were trapped by the Nazis. Yeah. They were trapped by the gates being shut by many other countries, including the US, and they had nowhere to go. Australia seemed like a great place. The British wouldn't have to let the Jews into England, but they could get them into Australia. And Australia at the time, this is another, the politics is very complex, lots of moving pieces. Australia was under a white settlement only rules, laws. Mm-hmm. And so the government was highly discriminatory against non-whites, especially Aborigines, and Jews. They were just white enough for most of the powers that be in Australia. So the idea was to bring them in, and they would have it served the idea of creating a European dominance of settlement, a majority of people in Australia. They were afraid of the Asians coming in, of Japanese, Malaysians, whatever. Filipinos, I don't know what they were afraid of. And they wanted whites in this part of the state.
So Jews were white according to this particular circumstantial definition. Yeah,
exactly. And you see that actually in the editorials and the discussion of the time, that the Jews are white for these settlement purposes.
Yeah, well, of course, in the Axis countries, particularly in Germany, they're being discriminated against, persecuted because they're quote unquote not white, etc. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we had talked about, you had mentioned this, the romantic nationalism. So in the Tasmania plan, there's not just romantic nationalism. There's actually a romantic story in addition to the nationalism. And that is that I had mentioned Linka before, who was a married woman, very successful journalist. She was married to a guy, I guess he's about 10, 11 years older than her, who was a dentist. He was a Jewish man, and they did not have a happy marriage from all interviews I conducted with both of their children, still living at the time when I was in Australia in 2009. And all indications are that she and Critchley Parker Jr., who was about 11 years younger than she was, had a romantic relationship. People ask me sometimes, was it an affair? I was like, it was an affair of the heart at the very least. I don't know, whatever happened in their rooms, I don't want to speculate on, but I will say that Peter Isaacson, Linka's son, he told me he was already, he must have been about 90 when I met him. He was a World War II pilot hero in Australia. Wow. And he told me that he hoped that his mother had an affair with Critchley Parker Jr. because he wanted his mother to be happy. So that story.
Yeah, how sad.
Critchley worked partially out of this romance to settle Jews in Tasmania. So there was a very romantic underground to this story, that it ended in tragedy because Critchley Parker Jr. was this very serious, very wealthy, very well-connected man who had a real legitimate sensitivity to the Jewish plight. He read what was going on. His father, by the way, was a Critchley Parker Jr. was a very anti-German. He was very fearful of the militaristic nationalism of Germany in World War I and World War II. And so he grew up in this atmosphere. He also had a good Christian education. So he was spiritually connected to the Jewish people, you could say, through the Bible, through the ancient sources. And he wanted to create, that's the title of my talk, this new Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to create this new Jerusalem in what is now southwest Tasmania, an area that at the time was virtually uninhabited and today uninhabited.
Mm-hmm.
And he set off there a few months after the initial scientific and governmental technocratic exploration there. He set off on his own. He was an experienced bushwalker, very experienced. He had done Arctic treks. He went down there to investigate and take note of resources. He believed there were mining resources down there, including gold and other minerals down there. And he wanted to walk the 60 or so miles from the extreme south of Tasmania to a river, the Gordon River in the north. And it would take about 60 miles. Tasmania is like Australia's Australia. It's the land down under, the land down under.
Mm-hmm.
And that little island there, he was going to walk part of it. He set off. He knew what he was doing. A lot of people say, oh, he didn't have enough knowledge. He didn't have enough food. He did. He made some mistakes
Mm-hmm.
when he was there, including getting all his matches wet and burning them by accident.
Yeah.
But he also had bad luck. The weather turned terrible. This is a wild part of the world. The weather can change really instantaneously. The roaring 40s, these terrible winds sweep up. It's on the southern sea, the Antarctic Sea, whatever you want to call it, to the south. It's not a lot of trees, not a lot of cover. This was an inhospitable, we could say, place, although an area of great wealth in terms of sea creatures, animals, seafood, fish,
Mm-hmm.
water. Certainly could be hydroelectric power. There's smaller mammals there. There's a lot. There are things to exploit, but it's pretty harsh climate. He knew that, but he got bad luck. And when he was down there in March of 41, 42, I think. I now the dates are escaping me. It's been a while, but he was down there. The weather turned. There was a storm, and he was caught in the storm, and he couldn't get up. He went up this mountain, climbed this mountain, Mount Mackenzie, to light a fire for rescue, as he had agreed upon with the only resident of this part of the country, and it wasn't seen. And then he didn't have enough matches. He couldn't do it again. And so when the wind swept in, he just tried to hunker down and wait out the storm. This March is fall in the southern hemisphere. The storm never abated.
Yeah.
He was trapped, and he was cold, and he probably had tuberculosis as a young man, and that's why he was exempt from the draft. And he got sick, and he died. But before he died, he wrote in this journal that Linka, his lover, had given him. He wrote these utopian but also remarkably technocratic visions of the Jewish state that was going to be found in Tasmania. They're heart-wrenching to read. They exist. They were found about 9 months after he died, 6 months after he died, something like that. His body was found by fishermen and in a moldering sleeping bag. One of these fishermen was so horrified he never again slept in a sleeping bag, I was told. And he was buried, and the plan died, and Linka was bereft. She never really truly recovered from his loss. And her daughter told me that when she got the call that Critchley was dead, that she remembers her mother just sort of collapsing.
Wow.
And so, these were vivid memories for these
Sure.
who were then teenagers at the time. But it's a terrible story. It was, again, this is a technocratic plan. It was approved. I don't think that Tasmania, this area called Port Davey, would have been a good place for a Jewish state. Western Australia, despite the heat and the dryness, actually had a lot more going for it. I would say many of the other plans I looked into had a lot more going for it. The Uganda plan, certainly. The Suriname plan in South America, absolutely could have done well.
Wow.
But the Tasmania plan was, as you say, it wasn't quite harebrained, but it wasn't perhaps as fully fleshed out as it might have been.
I see.
And this man, this non-Jewish man, gave his life in trying to save the Jews. Really.
Yeah, yeah. A very interesting story. I think by any standard, I mean, you have tragedy, you have an unbelievably wild and beautiful landscapes. You have technocratic schemes. You have a lot of creativity, a lot of adventure, and so forbidden love. All these things. So of course it's good material for the likes of us historians, but how would you explain to a layperson, okay, what's the value of looking at these lost Zions, at these schemes that may have had relatively, good chances of success, but ultimately never went anywhere or anywhere worth, let's say, worth more than a stone monument or two. I mean, what's the point? And perhaps I can invite you to talk about the implications of your study for, let's say, for an understanding of Jewish nationalism, of Jewish peoplehood, if there is such a thing, which I personally believe that there is, but I don't want to, prejudice the matter. What is your work on, let's say, Australia, on Suriname, telling us about the larger whole?
So I'll say a few things, and I think it's not a specifically Jewish lesson, so to speak.
Yeah.
That a few things. When I was down in Hobart, I got to get to know a little bit the great Australian novelist Richard Flanagan, and we were talking about this. He was very interested in the story, and he knew about it, and we met and had some drinks, and he was telling me that, in his view, history and reality is not made by realists. Yeah, technocrats are a part of that, but people with vision can inspire, can create life in ideas. And I think that that's a pretty powerful idea. And obviously, I'm coming from literature. All the people I write about, all the plans I write about were inspired, were promoted, were championed by a writer, playwright, some man of letters. Okay? Or in the case of Linka, a woman of letters, we could say.
Right.
Steinberg was certainly a man of letters. Melchiorowicz was a man of letters. But I also think that the wider applicability, and here I'm saying it's not just for Jewish nationalism, it's for people, it's for us today, is that when we look back at the past, at these things that failed, these ideas that move people around the world, and ideas that, in fact, in this one instance, caused a man to sacrifice his life, and certainly led Linka to sacrifice her happiness. These people didn't want to accept the shabbiness of reality. They wanted to really make a change.
Yeah.
They were, in a certain sense, utopians in that way. They saw a better world. They believed they know how to make it. And I think for us, it teaches us we don't have to accept the obstinacy of what we have today, that we can perhaps see other solutions. We can follow them. We can change things. That idea that what we have inherited is determines our future is not true. And changing. There is no reason. If you look at the history of Zionism, there's not we can explain how it got to be, but this is a crazy idea. Zionism was every bit, if not more so, ludicrous and absurd a notion than territorialism, and it succeeded, whereas territorialism failed.
Yeah.
So I think that this idea of the dream, the rejection of what I call the shabbiness of reality, we can alter fate or attempt to alter fate, and that effort is itself noble. That's what I find for a layperson. Looking at the history of failure can teach us. And in some sense, it's not entirely a failure. Their vision of a more humane, a more universalist Jewish nationalism, I think still resonates. It resonates certainly on the left in Israel. And I'm not probably obviously Palestinian, but I think it would be interesting to discuss these plans, these efforts of autonomy, of of high degrees of cultural sovereignty under another state that with Palestinians and what that might look like
Hmm.
for them. I do think that we can reject our present and plan for a better future. That's kind of what this taught me.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
myself, tend to be a total cynic. So, what is that worth?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very interesting. I think that's a fine point to stop our conversation and let people chime in via the Q&A function. I mean, I do have a couple of questions that follow from your last point, but maybe I'll give an attendee a chance to chime in. So, okay, well, this is just I guess a question of fact. Wasn't there a devastating cyclone that hit Darwin in the 1940s, and did that have any bearing on the decision to abandon the Kimberleys?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. Is my answer. I don't know. I take your word for it. The My understanding was, and the documents indicate that the plan for the Kimberleys and Darwin was abandoned because of the outbreak of World War II and the fears of a Japanese invasion, which later there were bombings of that area. I don't know about the cyclone.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
Sorry.
Um, yeah, I mean, one of the things that occurred to me as you were speaking is that there is a very contingent factor in history. All these.
Yes.
I mean, you mentioned the fact that had it not been for the very fact that he wet the matches, that maybe Critchley Parker would have survived, and there would have been more legs behind behind his
I,
team and
I
so
mean
forth.
that it's almost certain to me that he had tuberculosis. I was unable to get his medical records, but he
Yeah.
wasn't drafted. He slept in an outdoor porch with screens that were
Mm,
movable. It was on sled, so it could be moved at his very nice house out in the country, not too far from Melbourne, actually.
yeah.
At the
Yeah.
time, it was country. And he didn't smoke. Most young men, I mean, he was 29, 30, they smoked. Why didn't he smoke? Why wasn't he drafted? Why did he sleep in a screened-in porch that was movable? I'm assuming it was because he had tuberculosis
Mm,
and that there was a fear of infection, so it was covered up, and it's not mentioned in any of the sources that I could find, medical
mm,
records, whatever. And he didn't have a lighter. He would have had he smoked, he would have had a lighter.
yeah.
That
Yeah.
might have saved his life.
Right. Right.
So you
Yeah.
could say he died because of tuberculosis.
Gosh. Yeah.
Uh,
One more reason for all of us to head down to Summit Hut or REI or something like that in case we find ourselves.
or one of the takeaways from this talk is that you should start smoking.
I suppose. Um, so, I hear what you said toward the end about the dream being, in a way, the independent variable. Yeah. And I think there are probably numerous Zionists who, since the 19th century to today, might say, well, it's precisely the dream that caused Zionism to succeed, because, that is a dream that is embedded in Jewish history, in the connection of a people to a particular land, the land of its birth, and in that sense, all these other schemes, which may have been attractive from a different point of view, didn't have the same staying power. And yet, of course, there are anti-Zionists or non-Zionists who say, well, I mean, the fact that there were so many schemes for all kinds of, territorial, salvation across the globe, means that really Zionism is one among many European colonial schemes that ran roughshod over the rights of local inhabitants. The Jews are not natives to the land of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I imagine that during during the, let's say, the post-publication history of your life, you have faced questions like this. What do you make of them? What do you make of such claims?
Well, I think I understand the historical point and I understand the compassionate and sympathetic point, but I think we have to recognize, I mean, we're in the United States. I mean, I'm in Colorado, you're in Arizona. This was not the United States. It was Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
But before it was Mexico, it was a series of tribal kingdoms, lands, I don't know.
Yeah.
And before that, there were other tribal groups here. I mean, how far historically back to origins do we go?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, there's a kind of, not an intellectual dead end, but it may be, oh, okay, now what do we do? Point to make, like, yeah, it's true. Colonialism created horrific conditions for millions, much of the world, things we don't even know about, we can't even retrace, we can't even rescue from the record, that they're just awful.
Yeah.
But short of returning everyone to where they came from, which actually seems to me a rather retrograde view, I don't know what to do about it, nor do I understand where everyone came from. I don't think we know that.
Mm-hmm.
How far back do we go? Which tribal group that displaced another tribal group? I mean, peoples have fought forever. I recognize there's a difference when it is backed by military power, asymmetrical technologies, and a capitalist or merchant capitalism. I get all those things, and when people are enslaved or displaced, I understand all that. I do think that, very interestingly, in the case of both the Kimberley Plan and the Tasmania Plan, those people, Melech Ravitch and Critchley Parker Jr., who championed these plans, they were both extremely sensitive to the Aborigines who had been displaced. Not only that, they took the Aboriginal fate in Western Australia and the virtual eradication of Tasmanian Aboriginal groups as object lessons to learn from, so that Jews wouldn't suffer that same fate. They saw these tied, to the point where Melech Ravitch wrote a Yiddish poem about Aborigines, a Ballad of Doom, Untergang Ballade, to the point where Critchley Parker Jr. wanted to call the Jewish settlement he expected to create there Poinduk, which was the original name, Aboriginal name of that zone. So there was a way that the fate of groups who suffered colonialism were also seen as held up as a danger, so that Jews would learn from that Aboriginal past. I mean, yeah, it's in many ways it is true that we can view Zionism as a settler colonialist mechanism, certainly today. But it is also true that it was a anti-colonial, decolonial movement against the British.
Yeah.
And I never, going back for origins is fascinating. But one of the things that interests me about the territorialists is that they're not looking at origins, they're looking at the future. So what do we do now? What do we do now with this inheritance, and how do we make this a better world? That tends to be my thought process, but I recognize that's not always enough for people, and I recognize it's also sometimes controversial. It's not that I don't care about these colonial fates. Certainly that's what my new book is dealing with. But it's I'm not sure that is something upon which to build for a future.
Right. Yeah. Well, you've given us plenty to think about. We are at the end of our time here, so I want to thank you once again, Professor Rovner, for a very stimulating talk. I think your book will be discussed for generations. I mean, the cases are pretty impressive, pretty amazing, and they certainly leave us with a lot to think about with regard to the paradoxes of history. The degree to which people make decisions, especially under conditions of stress, that challenge, let's say, grandiose, heroic narratives of self-fulfillment and so forth. Yeah.
And if I could just say one last word, I'd say that
Sure.
so that people don't misunderstand, I'm not a partisan of the territorialists or a partisan of the Zionists or a partisan of the colonialists or the anti. I'm a partisan of the imagination.
Mm-hmm.
These are the writers who sought to make their imagination, to give it a stamp of reality. And to me, that's a fascinating way to connect what we in the literature business call nation and narration.
Beautifully put. Okay, excellent. Thank you again so much. Thank you all
Thank you,
for
David.
being with us. We're gonna well, we are recording this. Once the file is ready, I will see to it that we can edit it down to a good shape and put it on our Facebook page and so forth. So thank you all, and thank you again, Professor Rovner.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.